Soybeans are a long season crop, and yet care must be taken not to seed them too early. Soybeans seeded into soils below 8 degrees Celsius may become cold shocked, which will result in lower emergence, vigor, and ultimately yield. Have a look at this growth chamber work that was done for North Star Genetics. The top tray was planted into 21 degrees Celsius soil and kept at that temperature for 17 days. Pretty ideal conditions. The middle tray was planted into 21 degrees soil for 8 hours. Then temperature was reduced to 7 degrees Celsius for 4 days before returning to 21 degrees Celsius for the remaining 13 days. It doesn't look too different from the top tray. However, if you look at the bottom tray, it was planted into 7 degrees soil for the first 20 hours, and then temperature was raised to 21 degrees Celsius for the remaining 17 days. It doesn't look very good because it was cold shocked. The temperature the seed experiences while it is starting to imbibe water is clearly critical. Some producers will actually start seeding in the heat of the day just to ensure the seed is experiencing warm temperatures for the first 8 hours of germination. So you're caught between a rock and a hard place. You're seeding a long season crop, but you should be waiting until soils are 10 degrees before seeding. You also do not want to seed too early because soybeans will be sensitive to late spring frosts. So for Yorkton, this is a narrow window just after mid-May for seeding soybeans. Some are suggesting cultivating the soil in the fall prior to seeding soybeans can help with soybean production. Blackening the soil increases soil temperatures in spring and provides some protection from frost. This might enable producers to get out on the land a little earlier and increase the success of producing soybeans. But cultivating the soil is not great for soil conservation and for those who direct seed. So I designed this study to have a look at the impact of fall cultivation on soybeans seeded early, mid, and late May the following year. Specifically, here is the treatment list. Half the treatments were cultivated in the fall, and the rest were left as standing wheat stubble. Into each of these treatments, soybeans were seeded on May 5th, May 16th, and May 24th. Here's what the trial area looked like on September 24th, 2015. In the foreground is the cultivated ground, and beyond that is the standing stubble. Here's what the plots looked like after seeding May 5th. I took the soil temperatures early the next morning as the sun was rising, and I wanted to know what the minimum soil temperatures were. At seed depth, the cultivated soil was 12.1 degrees Celsius and the stubble was 11.5 degrees. These temperatures would represent the cold end for these soils. I believe now that the black soil warms to a higher level during the day, but then radiates off more heat during the night. So the daytime temperatures can be more different between the black soil and the standing stubble, and less different by the end of the night. However, both of these morning temperatures were above 10 degrees Celsius, and temperatures at seeding were warmer. The spring of 2016 was much warmer than average, so even on May 5th, soils were not cold enough to cold shock the soybeans. The other thing I'd like to point out is that the level of residue in the standing stubble is not excessive. If it had been heavier, I would expect a greater temperature difference. Here's how those same treatments, which were seeded on May 5th, appeared on June 27th. For this rep in particular, the soybeans seeded into standing stubble looked somewhat behind, but they certainly haven't been cold shocked. So let's look at the results. This table just presents main effects because no interactions were detected for any of the parameters measured. In other words, the effect of seeding into cultivated soil or standing stubble was the same, regardless of the seeding date. So, emergence didn't differ between cultivated and stubble treatments. Soybeans seeded into cultivated treatments were slightly ahead in maturity, but the difference was insignificant. Obviously, seeding date had a significant effect on maturity. The earlier you seed soybeans, the earlier they mature. Here is how those different seeding dates appeared on September 19th for the cultivated soil. You can see there's more leaves hanging on to the later seeded soybeans. Technically, there weren't any significant yield differences between treatments. Numerically, the cultivated treatments yielded a couple more bushels. There was also a couple more bushels for the earliest seeding date. Well, I didn't quite find what I set out to demonstrate. I wanted to show the effects of cold shock on soybeans, but couldn't seed into soil cold enough, even on May 5th. If you had a crystal ball, May 5th was the best time to seed because it was the highest yielding and earliest maturing treatment. However, I'm not going to recommend this seeding date. If we had experienced a late spring frost like we did in 2015, the early seeded soybeans would not have fared well. Mid-May is probably a good date to aim for, provided soil temperatures are above 10 degrees Celsius or better. If you have a stretch of warm weather in the forecast at that time, then go for it. Numerically, there was a slight benefit to seeding into cultivated soil. The crop looked like it was getting a better start in one or two of the reps. If the residue levels in the standing stubble had been greater, then maybe the benefit of cultivation would have been greater. I certainly wouldn't say cultivating the soil is a must for soybean production. You'll have to weigh that practice against soil conservation concerns. Well, that's it. Thanks to Adopt for the funding. I think soybeans have potential for the area, particularly as we are likely to keep getting warmer. Make sure it's a short season variety though, and don't grow lots of it. It's going to be one of the last fields you'll harvest for the season.